Hello, and welcome to the FluCoMa podcast. Today I'm talking with Dr. Thor Magnusson, who is a researcher in music technology, currently based at the University of Sussex and the Iceland University of the Arts. His research interests include musical performance, improvisation, new technologies for musical expression, live coding, musical notation and digital scores, artificial intelligence and computational creativity, programming education, and the philosophy of technology. So Thor is primarily a theorist and regards things from a perspective of contemporary musicology. For example, we shall be discussing some of his views on digital organology and instrument creation. However, he's also a developer. So we'll be learning more about SEMA, which is a platform for live coding with machine learning in the web browser, and of which he's a team member. And of course, he's also a performer. So we'll be discussing his approach to live coding as a performer and using FluCoMa related technologies in a creative way. So Thor, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be talking with you.
Great. So perhaps you could begin by explaining your background and how you got into the field.
Yeah, my background, I've always been doing music, and music is kind of in the blood. I really, it's just part of how I operate and express myself, and so played in a lot of bands and studied music, but my academic background is philosophy. So I started philosophy, and I got interested in the philosophy of mind. And from there, it relates to artificial intelligence, and I felt that I couldn't understand AI without actually knowing how to program. So I got interested in fiddling around with programming and learning programming. And it struck me immediately that code is a notational language for music. You can write music in code, both symbolic and signal or DSP. And at the time, in the kind of late 90s, I stumbled upon SuperCollider, which is this audio programming language. It was one of the first bespoke audio programming languages in computer music for real-time audio synthesis. In the mid-90s, computers were nearly not fast enough for real-time DSP. But in the late 90s, the computers that the public had access to, these new laptops and so on, started to be fast enough. And SuperCollider comes into that very strongly. And it was taught in various institutions, and you had some really important people working with it. And yeah, I started to experiment with SuperCollider a lot, and to build musical instruments. As part of a project, I started with a friend of mine, Enrique Hurtado, from the Basque Country, and we started ICSI software. These were experiments in real-time performance, improvisation, and we were trying to kind of get away from the linear nature of computer music, the kind of digital audio workstation track-based software. We wanted more improvisation, real-time interaction, and we were interested in graphical user interfaces. So we created a lot of new paradigms, new ideas for performance, and we saw them as experiments in interaction. So and of course, part of that is then interface design. this was great fun, and it kind of, we published these softwares online, and people started downloading them, and they became quite well known over the world. You know, we had users in the US, in South America, in Japan, and all over India. And it was just very rewarding to release software, free software, and have people comment on the software and so on. And we used the software in our own performances. So around 2004, I started my PhD at the University of Sussex in computer science and AI, and I was working on music software, and I was performing with people in live improv in Brighton. And at the time, there were a lot of kind of movements in live coding, lots of growth, experimentation. And concurrently with that, I was also feeling that in these in these improvisation settings that I was performing in with my graphical software, I felt that I often wanted to resort to live coding. I wanted to code in real time something that I couldn't do because I was working with software that was ready to play. So I started opening the software up and implement live coding as part of the graphical user interface. And that was really rewarding. And at the same time, there was this development of live coding in the UK and around Europe, of course, and the US, Mexico. But there were quite a lot of activities around live coding, and I set myself a task to try to create a live coding language, a bespoke live coding language for quick improvisation. And I created the Ixilang. The Ixilang is kind of notational language that allows you to live code very quickly, and it's very simple. Anyone can learn it in a few hours. Kids can play with it. It's very kind of forgiving in terms of syntax and so on. And it builds upon the pattern structures of SuperCollider, and so it's quite rhythm focused. And I enjoyed kind of challenging myself in that domain because I normally had been doing much more free-flowing improvisation, drone stuff, and so on. So I created the Ixilang. It became popular as well. I had some impact on how other people made their systems. But after a while, I wanted to get back into more sound-focused as opposed to event-focused music. And I created the Threnoscope. And the Threnoscope is a spatial microtonal system for kind of drone music. I saw it first as a piece, but like a musical piece, but it quickly became an instrument system. And I have now released it, and I can see people use it in all kinds of modes, making music that is very different from how I imagined music making with the Threnoscope. And I really enjoy that. I enjoy how people creatively kind of challenge the software and do something different with it. So from then, I been kind of live coding, collaborating with people. With Alex McLean, I set up the Live Coding Research Network, which was an AHRC funded project. We started the international live coding conferences, which are still running strong. And from but that's the kind of the practical side of my project. At the same time, I was busy kind of writing articles about computer music, and I had an HRC funded project called Sonic Writing, which resulted in a book. We can talk about the book later, but this kind of all related to kind of a platform that I was trying to build, or kind of a theoretical framework of new music, of new computer music, that I was trying to understand the context, the historical background. And the latest kind of computer music project that I've done before the ERC grant that I'm working on was SEMA, and we will talk about that later, but that is a kind of a live coding environment for the browser, and I've been working on that with Chris Kiefer and Francisco Bernardo and colleagues in Goldsmiths or London Arts University and Durham University. But yeah, it's an interesting to really sum up the answer to your question. I think I've got kind of my practice kind of comes from musical practice, from philosophy of technology, and programming or computer science. So it kind of, these three fields overlap in the work that I do.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll be covering, I think, aspects of each of them. So you mentioned sonic writing, which we'll be talking about, and SEMA, of course, yeah. And you mentioned also Chris Kiefer, who one of your colleagues at Sussex, along with Alice Eldridge, who created a piece for the FluCoMa project as well. So quick shout out to them. Yeah, you're talking about Threnoscope. I was wondering if just very quickly come back on that, because when I was looking at some of the images and the videos of Threnoscope online, it made me think of another project that had been done for FluCoMa by another live coder, Gerard Roma, who was actually one of the programmers on the FluCoMa project. But he's in the live coding field as well. You probably know of his work. And what struck me with Threnoscope was also these the visualizations, the very beautiful visualizations that are on one side of the screen with the live coding and the text on the other. And so he had a similar thing where so his instrument was this kind of data-driven sort of dimensionality reduction grid of a corpus that he was navigating with his. So you had the corpus grid on a big screen behind him, and you also had a little box with what he was typing in to control it. But the main thing that was your eye was pulled to was this sort of big grid, with little things happening in it and stuff. And so I was wondering, as a live coder, with the whole kind of show us your screens ethos kind of thing, how you go about curating what the audience is seeing, what you want to open up and show the audience what you're doing, how that kind of those visualizations in Threnoscope sort of enter into the equation for the audience and your performance as a live coder.
Yeah, good question. I mean, one of the premises of live coding, as you point out, is show us your screens. The idea is that it's helpful for people to see what we're doing. This is kind of a response to early 2000s computer music performances where people were sitting on stage with laptops, and you would just see the front of the laptop, and you wouldn't have a clue what was happening in the music. So there was almost a demand, like, okay, show us your screens. What are you really doing there? And people started projecting what they were doing onto the wall. This coincides, with the fact that most pubs and venues suddenly had a projector in the room. So we could just plug into that, and we could project our screens. So what are we projecting, and what is the language? Why should people be looking at this, even people who don't know programming? What's the point of having code on the wall? But the fact is that even if you're not a programmer, people enjoy watching what is going on. It's kind of course, I mean, it's human language. You understand the words that are written on the wall, and then it's about figuring out how those words are maybe resulting in the music you hear. So even a non-programmer can figure that out. And then programmers, they look at it and enjoy the music. I'm not sure it's essential to look at the code. I mean, the music should stand on its own, but it can be interesting to see what's going on, of course. This is real-time notation, but the what you're mentioning is some kind of graphic representation of the code, and I found when I was making the threnoscope, I found that it would be interesting to try to represent the nodes or the drones on a graphical user interface, especially because I started working in an 8-channel surround system, and I was playing around with how frequencies could move between speakers, how you could put different harmonics in different locations in the space, and the kind of psychoacoustic experiments with all that. And I just wanted to see this stuff because I was doing things that, yeah, I kind of needed to see it in order to understand what I was hearing and how I was perceiving the stuff. So I created this interface. And as you say, it's quite beautiful. I mean, musical mathematics are beautiful, harmonics are beautiful, scales are beautiful, tuning systems are beautiful. So it just turned out to become very beautiful interface, and that's not because I designed it as such. It's just, nature is beautiful, and also the kind of imperfections of tuning systems. If you for example have equal temper tuning, it all looks very spatial, chromatic scale, it's all very lined up and beautiful. But if you go into just intonation, which is more pleasing to the ear, you start to see that it's not so pleasing to the eye, maybe because the frequencies move, or the lines that I draw, they shift, so you get less equal kind of scales or tunings, and this was exciting to me. I really enjoyed playing with this, and I think people also enjoy this. People, they like to see and understand what they're hearing. They like to see the drones maybe move around the space. They enjoy understanding the movement of the music through visualization. It also offers me to do all kinds of things, like play with silence in performance, because if nothing happens for 5 seconds, but there's a drone moving into the sound area, people just wait. Whereas if I didn't have the visualization, people would start to clap probably, or something, or leave. So yeah, I find the visualization interesting, and not just the visualization of the code, but also representation. It's almost like representational notation of the music. So if the code is prescriptive notation, the visuals are kind of descriptive notation. And you see that also, I think, in the system. I think I've seen the system of Gerard that you're referring to, and that applies there too. But you can also look at systems such as Gibber by Charlie Roberts, where actually you have kind of the code, and you can see kind of highlights in the code where stuff is happening. So you can actually follow which notes are being played or which filter is being applied and so on. And that is very interesting as well. So I think, yeah, I think people enjoy the visual. I mean, we are a very visual culture, and it has surprised me actually, because drone music isn't necessarily the most popular music, you know, or you kind of challenge people a little bit with that kind of music. But what has surprised me is how much people enjoy Threnoscope performances, and I think part of it is the visualization.
Yeah, no, I certainly think that it contributes to making those performances so intriguing. Yeah, definitely. Great. So I would be really interested to hear about SEMA, so which is described as a playground for live coding, music, and AI. So I was wondering, yeah, if you could tell us a bit about it, how it works, and perhaps some of the motivations behind its development.
Yeah. So SEMA came out of the Mimic project. It was a project called Musically Intelligent Machines Interacting Creatively. And it was set up by people at Goldsmiths University with a team that has now largely moved to the UAL, Creative Computing Institute. But so it was Goldsmiths, Durham, and Sussex. And we split our tasks differently. The idea was to come up with a creative coder environment where people could work in the browser, writing JavaScript to play with machine learning. So it was about enabling non-computer science people to play with machine learning in a easy environment. And the web is obviously quite good for that, to work in the browser. There's no installation process needed. If you're running a workshop, you just point people to a URL and off we go. We can start to make stuff. So that was the idea of the Mimic project. And our task at Sussex was to come up with a live coding environment where we could kind of notate this machine learning and work on the sound engine. So the Mimic project is based on a sound engine called Maximilian. And that engine is kind of transpiled up to through Emscript and into kind of web audio. So it becomes a web audio sound engine. And we wanted to create a live coding language that would interact with this sound engine and enable machine learning to be part of it and machine listening. So we thought, what kind of language should we create for this? What is a machine learning live coding language? And we had some experience in creating live coding languages, but at the same time, we're now in a field of live coding where practice is concretizing around certain languages, certain platforms. So we start to see less diversity, less experimentation in live coding because people are using systems that are functioning really well and beautiful systems and enable people to get into music very quickly. So that's great. But we were kind of thinking we're missing the experimentation. So we came up with the idea of allowing the user to create their own language in SEMA. And so that would be a language that would interact with the sound or signal engine, as we call it. And our idea was that instead of coming up with a live coding language that can do everything, this live coding language that people make should just be very focused little languages. You know, one language could be about rhythm, another language could be about, you know, drones or tunings. And so people create their little languages almost as pieces or scores around something. So we implemented the Backers in our form, which is a system to create programming languages. And you can basically live code your language in the middle of a performance using SEMA. And it's quite easy to come up with your own language in this system. So that was our idea. And SEMA has worked quite well. People have been using it. We use it in our own research, and it is, yeah, it works well as a live coding system in the browser. Personally, I still love to work and think in SuperCollider, so I'm still kind of wedded to that environment, and it's great to see, for example, the FluCoMa project and the effort that you put into to make your work available within SuperCollider with all the documentation and help files and so on. But yeah, I think I've covered your question about SEMA.
Yeah, well, it's interesting talking about the web browser and things happening in the web browser. So, because I mean, so from my field, you know, as a musicologist, but also working with sort of digital interfaces in my research, things like that. Obviously, the web strikes me as, you know, a very good idea to start doing things within the web browser, because, you know, because of portability and extensibility and being able to, yeah, for example, have a URL that you can just open up anywhere in the world and all that kind of thing. I suppose this is coming from someone who's worked on the FluCoMa project, which is, you know, using lots of AI, but is also essentially derived around corpus-based stuff, so a lot of recorded audio and stuff like that. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about the interface of the web browser and perhaps around this question of, because it strikes me that naturally the web browser would be a difficult place to sort of approach corpus-based stuff, simply because of some of the technical limitations of working in a web browser. I was wondering if you could talk maybe about some of the affordances of the web browser and some of the limitations that you come up against.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, the positives are that you can share a URL. You can create a little live coding language and send it to friends and say, hey, look, I created this system. Do you want to have a play? And people play with your language, and this language could be music. It can work on phones and tablets and so on. Creative coders nowadays, a lot of them use JavaScript as their first language to learn. So JavaScript comes in really strongly there. It's a decent language to learn and simple. And the web audio API is, well, it enables you to create sound engines that are usable. It's possibly not the most forward-looking audio system. I mean, it seems to me that the designers of web audio API had a rather reactionary view of music and computer music, and the way we do things. But the stuff that people have done with it, you know, working around the limitations of of web audio has been incredible, you know. So we can see really interesting projects already. But the limitations are clearly what you are talking about. I mean, we're in a browser, it's protected environment, so you're not even allowed to load in sound files from the hard disk. So if you're doing corpus-based analysis of stuff, you know, how are you going to access your files? There are all kinds of tricks to do that, upload them onto the web or create certain permissions or whatever. But yeah, it's difficult. And also what we, you know, typically use as a communication protocol in computer music today, like the open sound control, you have to do all that through WebSockets and so on in the browser. So it is a limited, protected environment for good reasons, obviously. But it's maybe not the, I mean, it's great for these tutorials, for workshops, and to create systems. But if you really want to do hardcore work, you might want to use something else, like Super Collider or Pure Data Max or whatever it is that you work with. Or, I mean, if you're doing kind of track-based music, you probably want to work in a DAW on your laptop rather than in a browser. So it feels like it's a protected environment that is quite good for certain things, great for, you know, kids and teenagers to lay down some tracks quickly and share amongst friends, but for more kind of serious work, I guess the browser is not the place.
Yeah. Well, I still think it's important that, you know, projects like that are you know, pushing the limits of what can be done in the browser and you know, working within those limitations. And yeah, because I do think there is well, I mean, obviously it's news to no one that obviously there's probably going to be a big future in the internet and the web browser, but yeah, no, I think it's really important to be working within that kind of environment. So this, you know, I'd like to stay on these questions of sort of instrument design and interface, notably. So you've written extensively on this subject, and you're no stranger to the world of Nime. And so with such a large body of work on the subject, and we talked about your recent book, Sonic Writing, I was thinking sort of how best to sort of breach these ideas. I thought perhaps we could begin by talking about your recent ERC funded project, which is the Intelligent Instruments Lab, which you mentioned earlier, which I suppose perhaps looks to apply some of these ideas in a concrete way. So I was wondering if you could tell us about the project and perhaps how some of your thoughts on instrument design feed into it.
Yeah. So this book, this Sonic Writing, and the project that the HRC funded project that kind of was the space where I wrote the book in, the subtitle is called Technologies of Material, Symbolic, and Signal Inscriptions. So I'm really interested in how material, you know, the things that we use to build physical instruments, where do they come from? What are the kind of histories of these materials? For example, in digital technologies, you know, we have materials coming from sports or computer gaming or military and so on, and of course in older instruments, you know, electronics or wood and strings. And then the symbolic inscriptions like music theory, generative rules, musical scores, and so on. And then the signal inscriptions would be how we record the signal onto media, something that we've been doing for 100 years now only. So I'm looking into this and trying to understand where we are in computer music and what is really happening. Where is the kind of change? And through researching the book and writing about it, I mean, you can see how, for example, algorithmic music is nothing new. It didn't start with the computer. We have like histories of algorithmic music back in time in different contexts. Musical machines existed long before the computers. Artificial creativity existed before. Generative works, a lot of these ideas that we're dealing with today in computer music could have been done with in past technologies and were done. Those technologies were often, though, hard to reach, hard to build, expensive, and so on. So they never reached the public in a way that we have today with our laptop. I mean, everybody has a laptop almost. So the technology is in everyone's hand nowadays. But then it struck me that if there is anything new that the computer brings to computer music, it is really machine learning. Everything else, I mean, coding down instructions, programs, and so on, we can almost do with pen and paper, you know, and it's more laborious, but a lot of it could be done differently. But machine learning is kind of a paradigm shift, as you know. We're not programming the software to function in a certain way. We're kind of programming a system that can learn, and then we train it, and then we observe how it works in the context. So we build the environment for something to grow and adapt and learn. And here, you know, people have been using metaphors like, you know, nature, garden, or training an animal, or you know, or raising a child or whatever. You know, that's it's not about setting precise instructions, but to create the framework for the system to learn. And that is something we couldn't do before the computer. Obviously, you could try to make musical plants, for example. We can try to come up with some ideas where plants would make music slowly, you know, but or animals, train an animal to do something like that. But I think those are kind of exceptional cases, and what we're really seeing in music today is quite exciting. You know, the way that machine learning is used in the arts. So this is, you know, when I look at it from this perspective, I really start to get interested in machine learning and musical instruments. I'm personally, I'm not so interested in automated creativity. I'm more interested in real-time performance on the stage in a context with people, with other people, with instruments, and the kind of dialogue with the instruments and so on. So although I really respect and I enjoy the work of people who are doing artificial creativity or you know, systems that compose music, it's really impressive work. That's not what I'm interested in here. This ERC project that I'm working on is called Intelligent Instruments. So we're really thinking about how our instruments, typically physical instruments, you know, things that we hold in our hands, how they become adaptive or agential. You know, they have certain agency, they resist us, they talk with us, we have a conversation with the instrument. What is the effect of this on performers? How do we play together with these kind of instruments? How do we feel about technology in our hand that is resisting us or suggesting things or learning from us. I mean, this is new. We haven't, in our human history, we haven't had objects in our hands that are evolving without us changing them. So it's this training process that I'm interested in machine learning. So the ERC project, Intelligent Instruments, is really about this dialogue with the instrument and try to understand AI through music, through the musical platform. And I think what we are experiencing, what we're gaining from this research is understanding of AI that could be generalizable to other fields as well. I mean, music is just a brilliant platform to study all kinds of things. It's like a laboratory for human nature. It's about really tight human technology relationships. It's about human communication between people, like synchronization between people. It's about communicating with the audience. It's about new markets and new media forms, like Attali, talks about in his noise book, how music kind of preempts a new political economy. So music is really a platform to try things out, and what we're trying to explore in our project is precisely this intelligence in the instruments, the understanding of AI through embodied critical engagement with instruments, sound making devices.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I certainly subscribe to the kind of sort of network driven idea of these objects, these instruments having some kind of agency in the dialogue between the instrument player and the instrument that they'll be playing. And it's something that I think is a very important path for musicology to kind of go down. I mean, it's certainly one that in my own research I'm trying to develop as well, because I think it's a really fascinating, this kind of organological approach to everything, sort of understanding music through the relationships with our instruments. And indeed, so sort of along those lines, so as a musicologist, I find your ideas on digital organology really interesting, and sort of how newer practices in instrument design, such as using AI and things like that, sort of challenge our traditional approaches to organology. In an article you wrote called Musical Organics, you proposed a sort of rhizomatic, heterarchical perspective, which kind of offers an approach that can be a solution to theorists who want to work with new artistic practices that are ever more multidisciplinary and sort of expanded across disparate networks of entities. I was wondering, perhaps from a musicological perspective, if you could perhaps break down some of the challenges that these new practices in instrument design present, and in musicking in general. Sort of break down some of the challenges for musicology, and how perhaps you see musicology in a general sense evolving in light of those practices.
Yeah, great question. I mean, we have a funny situation in music and music education today. Just look at the conservatories. What are they teaching? What are the departments called, or the strands that, it's strings and brass and percussion and the kind of forward-looking conservatories or music schools might have something called electronics or something, and it's based on our understanding of music and music education, which can be quite traditional. And we can see it a little bit. I mean, we have these classification, like you mentioned, the organological classifications in the past, and there are many of them. People trying to classify musical instruments. And this comes from a desire, as Foucault talks about, desire in the modern time to classify things. People were traveling around the world, colonial powers bringing weird objects back to Europe, musical instruments or whatever, and they were putting them up in museums or in some collections, and they somehow had to sort all this out and put them into, decide where to put things on the wall. So classification is a way to try to understand a complex field. And then you have like Hornbostel-Sachs classification system, which is the most used one nowadays, and splitting things into idiophones, membranophones, aerophones, and chordophones. These are the key things. And then you have sub branches of this tree, and it kind of works mostly in traditional musical instruments, although there's kind of a debate whether the piano is a percussive instrument or a string instrument, and so on, but when we have electronic instruments, and in particular digital instruments, these classifications don't work anymore. And yeah, you can try to come up with solutions like the electrophone or the digiphone or something, and just stuff everything into a branch of that tree. But at the same time, if you're familiar with, as you are, with theoretical developments in linguistics and biology and other things, the tree thinking is really breaking up. And that's something that Deleuze and Guattari express really well in their book Thousand Plateaus, where they substitute the tree metaphor with the rhizome metaphor. And the rhizome then is an entity, grass, basically, roots that connect underground, but without a core branch. There's no trunk. It's all connected, like our brain, basically. I mean, there's no tree in our brain. it's just a web of connections. And what I tried to do then in the digital organics, and I chose the word organics carefully, relating to the rhizome idea, to the growth of vegetation or the brain. But organ and organics is really, I mean, the Greek word organ means a musical instrument. We have an instrument called organ as well, but we also have bodily organs, and they are instruments. So, and in Greek, in ancient Greek, also the instruments like tools are organs. So a harp or a hammer or the heart, the human heart, they're all organs, And so digital organics is a way to try to understand the heterogeneity, the rhizomatic nature of our musical instruments. Where do they come from? What are we assembling together when we create a new musical instrument? And then when you trace the origins of our instruments, we are tracing them back to military, as I said before, military technologies, computer games, sports, computer science, and of course, that's just the technology, but then the ideas they derive from HCI, and now largely from machine learning and machine listening. So we have so many techniques and technical elements that are merging together into our new musical instruments. And that's really what the digital organics is about, is to try to analyze the origins and to trace the kind of history and origins of these things and how they come together. So I'm not proposing a new branch. I'm proposing a method of looking at things that is perspectival, where you can come up with new perspectives, assemble things together for a particular purpose, but all that will collapse if you change perspective and look at it from another perspective, you know. So it in a way it's a rhizomatic organology, like you point out. I think it's important to understand their instruments, to be critical about their instruments, and to have a theoretical frameworks for it, and to actually do musicology, organology of digital musical instruments, even ethnomusicology, or what I call ethno-organology, you know, try to understand how our musical ideas are inscribed into our digital technologies. And that's not an easy thing to do, but very interesting and rewarding.
Yeah, talking about the grammatization that we can sort of read the musical thought as being inscribed into instrument. Yeah, it's a fascinating article, and I must say one of the articles that really kind of set me down the path in my own PhD research. So I thank you for that. It was a really eye-opening article that I really enjoyed. Yeah, no, it's for those who haven't read it, I strongly recommend reading it, as I do sonic writing as well. Yeah, great. I'd like to steer the conversation perhaps around to some of the FluCoMa technologies more kind of specifically. So a big part of the toolkit is bringing so music information retrieval techniques to the hands of creative coders. So we've got automatic segmentation, signal decomposition, descriptor analysis, dimensionality reduction, and these tools for creating data-driven musical interfaces. So MIR, it's something that you cover also in sonic writing, and there was one quote from the book that I found quite intriguing. So you were describing the working environment that these technologies create for the composer becomes like an editing studio for a movie, with a resulting division between the art forms, which is fading. So I'm wondering if you could break that down and perhaps talk about some examples of using these technologies specifically in your own creative practice as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. The FluCoMa toolkit is just a fantastic example of how all these new technologies are coming together and enabling creative coders or musicians to apply these technologies in their work. So it's a really interesting toolkit, and it relates to what I call in my book a change in signal inscription. So let's say we have 100 years history of signal inscription of music, roughly 100. I mean, I'm talking about the invention of the phonograph and the kind of change that recordings represented in the music industry. So the marketization and dissemination of music through recorded media. So we have machines listening to music, inscribing music, and then producing music. So the vinyl or the record player and so on. But what is perhaps new now with the machine listening is that we actually have a machine intelligently understanding the signal, not just reproducing it, but listening to it and being able to do things with it. So what do you then listen for? What is the machine trying to understand from the music? And that's up to us to decide. And the FluCoMa is a toolkit that allows the musician to take their own approach to the signal. You know, what do I want to listen to in this signal? Is it onsets? Is it certain frequencies? Is it, I mean, what is it in these FFT frames that you want to listen to? Is it kind of classification of sounds? So now we have machine listening that is able to understand the signal, classify the signal, do things with it. And we have machine learning that could actually be trained to do certain things that we set it to learn. So in a way, we're in a fantastic situation to do things with the signal, to listen to the signal with the machine in a way that we can't because we're not fast enough, or, you know, it's a different understanding of the signal, you know. Of course, the machine is never understanding music in the way that we do. It would be absurd to even try to do any kind of comparison between machine listening and human listening, but we can have the machine listen to some certain things. And yeah, I'm really impressed by the FluCoMa toolkit to enable these kind of things. Arguably, you could then say that since there are certain technologies I mean, there are classes, eugens, and so on, that, or objects in the toolkit that do certain things, FluCoMa in a way is also suggesting a certain approach to machine listening and machine learning. And that's something that we have in any environment, like Super Collider, Max, whatever. When you create a help file or some kind of a documentation, you create an example that becomes you create a documentation or an example that becomes a suggestion for thinking, you know, in the user. And that is an interesting thing to kind of behold in the future, how people are gonna reject the script of FluCoMa, perhaps, you know, break what is suggesting to you and do things differently. Like I talked about with my threnoscope, you know, people are rejecting the script that I give people. Here is a drone instrument, go and play with it. I mean, and then they make a 16-track sequencer with it, you know. It's these kind of breaking and rejecting the script that I'm quite interested in. And I think FluCoMa will see in the future with these powerful technologies, you're going to see a lot of people doing weird things with it that you haven't you couldn't even imagine when you made the system.
Yeah, I mean, I know it was certainly, so obviously I wasn't part of the programming team, so that it was kind of less, though wasn't really what I was thinking about during the project. But yeah, I know for the developers, certainly, it was one of the primary questions was, yeah, this idea of suggesting approaches, black boxing, you know, how can we avoid telling people what they're supposed to do with the tools? And at the same time, I know that's why, you'll know that there was a group of 9 or 10 creative coders that were commissioned to use the tools and sort of challenge the presuppositions that the team were making in the interface and things like that. Yeah, it was definitely a question that was in their minds, but that, you know, with any digital environment, with any environment that we're going to configure, there's always going to be some kind of idea of workflow that's going to be inscribed within that environment, but and then there'll always be people that will thankfully go against that and challenge those things. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. But someone else who may be on the podcast soon, who's has a lot of experience with using neural network regression for controlling digital interfaces. So obviously the most well-known interface is Wackonator, and so that person's coming from Wackonator, which has a certain way of dealing with normalization, which is kind of inscribed within Wackonator, and that I don't believe you have access to as the user. You may have, so haven't used it extensively, and so when they were coming over to FluCoMa, sort of where that use isn't inscribed within the workflow, there's a normalization object, there's a standardization object, and in that regard it's more open. But yeah, also seeing how leaving that path open to the user also kind of created friction for the user, where it was made them difficult for them to make that transition. But yeah, it's a really fascinating question, especially for people that are developing these environments. Are something that you no doubt come up against in developing SEMA and things like that. Yeah, sort of along those lines. So this is still within sonic writing. You talk about you cite David Beer's ideas on the notion of the algorithm, which would now be taking on its own force of social power. You write. So this is how sort of MIR and other tagging and classification techniques and what we do with this information are inflecting our listening practices also, be it across large streaming services or more local levels. So I was really interested by that. I was wondering if you could break it down, but also perhaps break that down into the context of a package like FluCoMa, which aims to bring these kinds of tools to anybody with a laptop. And there was also the formulation. So we talked, I think you may have mentioned it earlier, where you called instruments as objects of resistance. I was wondering if you could sort of explain more what you mean by that.
Yeah, there are many kind of layers in this question. I think when I was referring to David Beer and the algorithm, I mean, we are in a situation where we're starting to use technologies that are quite prescriptive. And if you want to be kind of free of, well, I have a friend who talks about people being victims of technology when they use commercial music software, because there's so much inscribed in the way that you think and the way the system works. I wouldn't phrase it so strongly, because there is always possibility to change, to resist the script, as we talked about, to break the conventions and to misuse things like we do with our acoustic instruments as well. But arguably there is more theory inscribed in digital musical instruments and composition systems than in the acoustic instruments. So we're dealing with a world where machine learning is increasingly being used to learn from users. Some companies are trying to set up subscription systems so they can learn from the users of the software, where they can then train the software to make certain types of music, which would then help other musicians to make their music. That can be very helpful for novices, for example, that the software can just roll out a nice drum rhythm for you based on the latest trends or whatever. But we then stumble into questions of creativity and yeah, we'll probably talk about that later. But I think when we talk about instruments as objects of resistance, you know, there is a dialogue between us and the instruments, or the systems. You know, they are strongly kind of, they have certain agenda or script or design, and you talk with them and you kind of try to converse with them, try to do the music that you want to do, or you follow their script as well, and let the instrument guide you in the way that it's designed. I mean, there are different, I think all this is on a kind of continuum, really, how people approach these things. But any technological object is an object of resistance. You know, it's the philosophy of the object, you know, and it's just like the hammer, you know, it's an object that is designed for a certain purpose. And the joke in the philosophy of technology is that if the only instrument you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, you know. But if you have more instruments, more tools, you can start to express yourself differently. So I guess that's what the resistance is. And nowadays we're kind of playing a lot with this all around the world. People are making musical systems that are kind of resistant systems, like where you don't have full control over the instrument. You want the instrument to have a conversation with you or have a dialogue with the instrument. A lot of people are exploring notions of agency in instruments. And in our lab in Iceland, we have an instrument designer called Halldór Ulfarsson, and he created the Halldóraphone, which is an instrument, electroacoustic instrument that basically has agency because of its physical nature. And performers who play with it continually describe how much they enjoy not being in control of the instrument, and to have that kind of agency in the instrument and the dialogue with the instrument. This is something that we're going to see increasingly with machine learning, obviously.
No, it is interesting because, yes, along those lines, there's a quote by Sayers that he was talking about the idea of interface, and I think he gives the example of 2 points that are interacting that send a message between each other, and yeah, if the message gets sent in an optimal way with no resistance at all, then in fact the relationship and the interaction between those 2 points just evaporates. It doesn't exist anymore. So for there to be relationship and kind of interaction, there has to be some kind of failure. There has to be some kind of resistance, and I like to think of it as like a sort of loss of resolution in the data that's being passed along, which is kind of against the whole kind of commercial approach to interface design and sort of functionality and being allowed to do things quickly. But yeah, no, I think this idea of a musical instrument as being something that is going to push back, and that there is going to be this kind of, even if it's a digital instrument, a kind of tangible resistance against what you're trying to do. I think it's a really intriguing way of thinking about that kind of thing. Yeah, no, it's really interesting.
I mean, human language, I mean, if you think about information theory, you have a sender and you have a receiver, you have a medium channel, and then they talk about signal and noise and so on between the sender and the receiver. But what is it really that you're sending? You're sending maybe messages of human language, and we don't understand the words the same way. I'm not sure you understand me. Can you be sure that I understand you? You know,
Yeah.
We apply the same words, but we might have a very different understanding of them.
Yeah, no, it's kind of artistic creation as sort of articulating this essential question of kind of confronting our agency and our what we're trying to express with the physicalities of the world and even how it's received by people. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So as sort of along those lines of sort of this script that we've been talking about, so obviously another aspect of that, which was a concern of the FluCoMa project, so was making sure that the documentations and the tutorials and stuff are really solid. But we've also had lots of other ways that we kind of try and reach out to people in the world, workshops, forums, these podcasts, articles on the Learn platform, that kind of stuff. So education of music and technology is something that you practice and that you also write critically about. So I was wondering if you could discuss your approach to, for example, teaching these kinds of practices and what your approach is in that regard.
Yeah, when I teach, for example, computer music or techniques or technologies within the field, I like to present the field, the issues, the problems, the history, the aesthetics, the cultural groups that are operating within the field, and try to do that in a diverse way, such that we're not just talking about some isolated groups in France or Germany or the UK or the US or whatever, but rather to see a global perspective and history, and to talk about the problems that we're trying to overcome in our music or technological development, but also the goals. What are the aesthetic goals? What are the kind of performance situations that people are trying to create? How are they relating to the audience? What is the musical kind of context, the aesthetics, and so on? So I give a lot of examples to students, show them stuff, talk about stuff, try to relate it to their own practice. I mean, that's essential, isn't it? You have to, you can't just play them some Stockhouse and elektronische Musik and then ask them to make electronic music. That kind of music is 70 years old or whatever, and they don't relate to it at all. It has to be something that is relevant to their world, their kind of musical goals. And that's where you then can try to introduce the technologies. So here is a system, here's something where you can do this or that. Let's take a look at examples. So I try to provide examples to my students always, so they can build from. And it's very interesting. You can give them an example that plays, a 16-step sequencer of drum loops or something with some buffers or whatever. But if you give it to 10 people and they go away and they try to do something with that example, you're going to have extremely different results, because everybody takes it into their own kind of musical world and develops it and has a relationship to the code or the system in a very different way. So I think FluCoMa is doing that really well. You provide examples for us users to develop our music from. But it's important to have, the understanding and the examples and diversity, musical diversity as well. Try to connect to different musical cultures. I mean, we're not all doing electroacoustic music. A lot of the experimental music within academia is, it's experimental because you're coming up with new technologies. You are doing experiments. You're doing research. So it's kind of natural that the music is experimental and new. But if we're talking about users, as FluCoMa is trying to do, or recruit users to the platform, you really need to think about what is the music that people are actually doing.
Yeah, well, it's relating to people's practice, not just presenting the tools as a thing, but really trying to relate to their practice. I think one interesting example of that was so I mean, obviously I think there's been maybe like 40, 50 different workshops, all kind of different in nature, but many of them were in sort of academic contexts where people that are in kind of electroacoustic music that are kind of already going to have perhaps a vague idea about what kind of thing we're going to be able to do with this. But one workshop that I found quite intriguing was I can't remember exactly where it was. I think it was in Australia. So it was my colleague James Bradbury who did it, and it was something like FluCoMa for field recording. And I thought that was a really really good idea because it was specifically quite a not a niche, but a very, very specific kind of set of goals that people that do field recordings are going to want to use these tools in a very specific way. And obviously, to prepare and to carry out that workshop, he had to be very, open and listening to their approach to things. Because, I think it's a really interesting way of approaching it. So obviously, when you have the luxury of being able to do a workshop or teaching something to a person who's in front of you, then you're really going to be able to work on that dialogue and stuff. But even in a more general sense, with things like the forum, the discourse forum on FluCoMa, I think that they're being able to kind of implement that in some way, and it's certainly the use cases fed very much back into the development. So that's great. So as a final somewhat open broad question, which I've asked a few of the guests, which I think can perhaps sound a bit cliche, but I think can be interesting to get people's take on it. I was wondering if you could tell us how you might see machine learning as morphing musical practices in the future. So obviously, it's kind of a stereotypical image we have of people thinking about things like deep learning in music is like being very wary of it, and people being scared that it will replace musicians, things like that. I was wondering if there was space in the current kind of capitalist driven music industry for machine learning driven practices, and do you see machine learning developing and unlocking creative potential for us in the future, or could it be used for more ominous means in shaping our listening practices and wearing down our creative drive? I was just wondering how you sort of see things developing in the future, and if you could talk about that.
Well, all of it. It's dangerous, but it has opportunities, obviously, and it's all about who are the players, who are the kind of who go along with things, and so on. Humans come up with technologies, and it is impressive. I mean, we're an interesting species. If you look at Mid-Journey art now and photographs and so on, it's really incredible where it's gone. And I'm not talking about artistic content. I'm talking about just the technology in itself. It's just pretty amazing. But then you have the ethical questions around it, like whose pictures are these? Whose art are they training the model with, and so on. So that's all very problematic, and we're actually thinking about these things a little bit in our lab. Like, if we get users to or a data set or users to train a model, and we release the model, what kind of contract should we have with the people who trained the model or whose data set we used? Do you necessarily want your style to be available to other people, or your voice, even your human voice, to be used by other people? So there are a lot of kind of issues about personal expression that can be kind of captured and shared with people. You can also think about the big companies, for example, that are data hungry for machine learning purposes. They are not stealing anyone's idiosyncratic kind of style, but they're creating maybe a general style or representation of music that comes from the masses. But then the question is, what is it that you gain from it? What is that? If you have native instruments software that is based on users' kind of input, and you make music with it with machine learning, and the CEO of Native Instrument is actually, I mean, he's got a vision that is not bad. I mean, he says 50% of people want to make music, but only percentage of that people had musical education. So we want to provide people with the tools to make music. What's wrong with that? That's beautiful. The more people make music, the better, the happier we are, the more fulfilled we are, and so on. There's nothing wrong with people making music. And if we can have machine learning to help novices to make decent music, that's great. But then it becomes a question of creativity as well. If you like certain Berlin techno style, and if the machine can just check out another track that is very similar to that, almost identical, but different, where's your creativity? Where is your authorship? Where's your artistic expression? And that's where really computing technologies are challenging our ideas of creativity now and our practices as producers. I mean, I tell my students, if a computer can do this, what are you going to do? How are you going to be different from a computer? And that's a challenge for people today, and an interesting challenge and a good challenge. But it relates to the idea of creativity, obviously, and our historical, cultural ideas of creativity, which, in the Western world is very much about from modernism, and it's about originality, the idea of the creator, the authorship, the author, the new, avant-garde, all these ideas of that we have very strong in our culture. And machine learning kind of comes into this space and disrupts quite a lot. But our ideas of creativity and originality is very different from other cultures, So it's going to be interesting to see how machine learning will affect all that. I'm not pessimistic at all. I think it's just human nature, to adopt new technologies, and things change. I mean, when we had a soundtrack in the movies, the people who played the music under the silent movies, they lost their jobs. When with recording, the people who played in live radio lost their jobs. There's always change in music, but I'm not sure it's all kind of disaster, or I don't think machines are going to replace humans at all. We're going to be collaborating with machines. And if anything, there are going to be more people doing music than before. But as I did mention Atelier earlier, but what might then happen is that music is not an area or a field like in the 60s where you had some bands that just got really rich because they produced some pretty good music. Now we have so many people producing pretty good music, and the industry is not supporting all that mass of people. I mean, and the media formats are not supporting that. I mean, these streaming services are more like the taps in our kitchen. We just turn off the tap and there's music. It's not products that we buy anymore, and even the touring industry is becoming problematic. So perhaps we're going back to a music of the town square, where everybody makes music and it's not an industry for a certain group of people. And yeah, I mean, that's bad for the people who want to be really rich from music, but it's kind of nice for people who enjoy a lot of music and musical practices and music as a part of human nature,
Yeah. Oh, great. Well, I think there's some nice uplifting words there to finish on, and also a challenge as well to people who are making music in this very intriguing kind of configuration technology that's happening at the moment. Yeah. So thank you so much, Thor. That was really, really interesting. So as always, all of the links to the various things that we've talked about today will be living on the page beneath this video on the Learn platform. So there'll be a link in the YouTube description to that page. Yeah, so Thor, thank you so much. It was great having you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks.
Great. See you again soon.
See you later. Bye-bye.